Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's go to China. Only let's be careful where we go in China because we have to watch out for COVID. And that's what we're going to talk about. Because I have not yet had a conversation with anybody from China about COVID, but we know that in the last several weeks or months, there has been a big change in their policy about how to handle the pandemic, and it's cost a lot of lives, or maybe it's been a good policy. I'm not quite sure. We're going to talk about that. And I have some friends here who certainly are China experts, and I'm going to expect that they'll just have conversation among themselves. And Yang Chen is a research scholar in law and a fellow at Yale Law School's Paul C. China Center, where her work focuses on the development of science and technology in China and also on U.S.-China relations. She was trained as a particle physicist and has worked and did work for over a decade at the Large Hadron Collider. So it was quite a change in career line when she moved over to law. And I guess in Pennsylvania, where are you, sir? Are you
Philadelphia?
in Philadelphia? Okay. Guibin Yang is a professor of sociology and communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And in Winnipeg, I presume, is my friend Ellen Judd, who is a professor emeritus of anthropology at the University of Manitoba. And she has been living and working in China for many, many years. And mostly in rural China. Professor Yang, let's ask you to give us a briefing, because you probably are following things. Well, I know you're following things better than I am because I'm not up to par at all. But tell us what has been going on and your understanding of what to make of the situation in China.
Well, I think first, thank you, Meta, for having me, and really wonderful opportunity to talk with great scholars and friends. So the current situation, really, I think the biggest policy change, as you briefly mentioned, was really the early December, late November last year, when China decided to stop its zero COVID policy, and that happened very abruptly and surprising to many, because a lot of us here was prepared for a long haul, and partly I think it was in response to the protests that were happening in the streets, but partly also I think was in response to the changing situations of the virus, and of course many other related situations, economic conditions, and so on. So just I think that's the main thing I would mention. And I also would like to add very quickly that our attention ever since then has really focused so much on this sudden change of zero COVID policy and its consequences, including the huge number of deaths that happened as a result. But I think as a sociologist, I would like to look at this policy change within a longer time span, at least the 3 years of the pandemic since the beginning of 2020, and taking a look at the broader change, both in terms of policy, in terms of how citizens manage the situations, and in terms of the mutations of the virus. And so I would just briefly, start with that remark.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I'm interested. I hope I'm sure we'll come back to that. But the political implications of this overnight reversal, what does that mean in terms of power dynamics? What does it reflect? And does it have any other implications in terms of the power structure in China? But I don't know whether you want to answer that yet, because I guess we want to just get clear maybe about what has actually happened and in what sequence. Yeah, maybe you can kind of sketch for us the trajectory of their policies, because first of all, we know that they were not very forthcoming about what was going on. Everything was hidden, and then I don't know what kinds of pressures led to what policy changes over the whole 3-year interval for you.
Right. I think if we start with the lockdown of Wuhan in January 2020, that also happened just abruptly and surprising, shocking, really shocked all of us, shocked the world. And, that's, I think, the major first policy. But then after the lockdown was lifted in Wuhan, that's in early April 2020, pandemic basically came under control. So the country was immediately opened, and we here we were still under lockdown. And we really envy our colleagues back in China who are already traveling around for conferences, much of the rest of 2020. And I think early 2021 as well, I think the situation really became serious with the Omicron virus, and because of its highly infectious, character. And then that's the time, if I remember correctly, that's the time, July 2021, when the zero COVID policy came into place, really, I think, rigorously, and the country began to have one lockdown after another, major cities around the country. And since then, it seems that it's impossible to reverse that policy anymore. It's almost like felt like it took on the life of its own. And we know, like in Chinese policy making, a policy once made is not easy to change. It has its inertia for all kinds of reasons. I'm not sure we have time to go into. But partly also, we know that there is relatively low rate of vaccination among the senior population. And so that was at relatively weak capacity of hospitals around the country to manage the situation if there was a really national breakout. And that's what happened after the zero COVID was suspended late last year.
I'm a little unclear about is you as you mentioned it, everybody was jealous because your friends in China could travel when people in the rest of the world couldn't much. And yet, how come it didn't really decimate the population at that point? If they were traveling around, why did they get off pretty light for some reason?
I think that the virus was already under control. For instance, in Wuhan, during the 76 lockdown period, there were citywide testing of basically the entire population of the city. It's a kind of zero COVID policy, zero COVID testing. If ever a case was found, or also a case of near contact was found, these individuals would be put into temporary hospitals, would be moved away from their family for treatment. So in that's why people were able to travel around, because there was no longer the spreading of the virus in much of the rest of 2020.
Okay. Listen, I want to encourage the Yang and Ellen to really participate by asking each other whatever is on your minds, as if I'm not here, because I'm sure that you're in a private conversation. You would have concerns that please don't wait for me to call on you. In other words, because I know you have things to share with each other and questions to ask. Yang, what's on your mind?
Well, I thought I might follow up on Professor Yang's point with regards to just like the brief timeline. And I think if I take out two time periods, right, at the very start of the pandemic and during at the end of last year's the policy reversals. And I think what we really see here is the political dynamics with regards to policy making and with regards to policy implementation in China, how it may often be characterized in the Western discourse as some kind of very top-down uniform approach, but really power is fractured within the Chinese bureaucracy, and the lack of transparency is often because of a conflict of interests. So what we saw at the very beginning of the pandemic in Wuhan or in Hubei province is the initial obstruction came from local bureaucracies, even at hospital administrator level and local health bureau level. And also information can flow within the Chinese bureaucracy. So the Chinese CDC was informed at fairly early on, but they didn't have the legal authority to inform the public, not in the US, as in the US case. And so there was information flow in the Chinese bureaucracy itself, and there were central government sending in delegations to inspect and such. But the public was more or less still being kept in the dark until there is this lockdown in Wuhan, as Professor Yang just mentioned, that feels very abrupt. And if we jump through this 2.5 year time span, right? What has happened is when China was implementing basically a zero COVID policy through 2020 and much of 2021, it was not really alone in the world. Other regions and countries like Taiwan and New Zealand also followed a very similar policy because that seemed still feasible with the nature of the coronavirus at the time. But because a pandemic is a dynamic situation and the virus mutates, so what really happened was, as Professor Yang also mentioned, with Omicron, it becomes much more infectious. So eradication or elimination within the society becomes epidemiologically infeasible. And that was when countries like New Zealand and Taiwan also abandoned their very strict, effectively zero COVID policies, or also Vietnam. But this was where the Chinese government doubled down because it is no longer just a public health measure. The Chinese government was banking its the security of its political system on its ability to effectively control or even eliminate COVID-19 within its population. And this is also where we see the implementation of a policy at the local level is not necessarily by the word of the central government, but through interpretation. Like the central government never said explicitly, you should kick down doors of people's residences, drag people into central quarantine through these violent measures, or destroy property and spray disinfectants in people's homes and such. But these violent measures are being implemented on the local level because zero COVID is no longer just a public health metric. It is a metric of political allegiance and loyalty. And this was how it was interpreted through the year of 2022. And to the fall, this is very obviously economically unsustainable, that the cost of maintaining zero COVID with mass daily testings and mass quarantines and economic stagnation and a decimation of a lot of small businesses is putting a lot of financial burden on local governments, and the central government is aware of it as well. So there needs to be some kind of off-ramp, some kind of exit from zero COVID. And this is what the central government has been trying to do through the fall of 2022. There is some expectation that maybe because of the 20th Party Congress that there needs to be stability and such. And so this policy is not going to, there's not going to be dramatic change in this policy before the Party Congress, but there is some understanding that maybe things will change through the fall. However, what has happened is, for example, on November 11th, when the central government issued this 20 points on improving COVID control, which is in a way to relax zero COVID policies and go and gradually change this from elimination to mitigation. But this interpreted on a local government level is still that the central government is adhering to zero COVID, and that is still some of the top level messaging as well. And there were some individual municipalities, for example, like Shijiazhuang, that attempted some temporary easing, and there was outbreaks of cases. And so this is actually a very dynamic and fluid situation. And before the people went on the streets to protest with the so-called white paper movement, the immediate catalyst was this fire in Urumqi that claimed at least 10 lives in this majority Uyghur. Sorry.
Remind me of what this white paper was. This when they were holding up pieces of white paper?
Yes, so this was the weekend of November, of basically Thanksgiving weekend here in the U.S., right? So this was where people, the anti-lockdown protests, some of the messaging elevated to a higher level of for free expression against tyranny. But really, the immediate catalyst was this fire in a lockdown building in Urumqi when they were enforcing the zero COVID policy. So that was the immediate catalyst to the government's reversal of zero COVID policy. However, there is a broader dynamic behind it that the protest gave the government this excuse or the timing of it, but it wasn't necessarily just to the people. It feels like it was an overnight reversal, but on a policy level, it was really dynamic, and there were different layers to it. And so immediately, like after the protests, like on December 7th, when the central government issued the so-called new 10 points about precision measurement. However, this interpreted at the local level.
Sorry, what is precision measurements?
Precision control. So it was no longer blanket quarantine. So during zero COVID, a lot of the quarantine measures were put in place was if there is one person who is suspected of having COVID, their entire building, whether it's like different floors, different units, would be sent into centralized quarantine. And so, or even entire districts would go on lockdown, like entire residential communities and such. And so this was very, very brutal and causes a lot of disruption to work and to people's lives, and causes a lot of other issues. So the government was trying to have an off-ramp to this kind of very blunt force and one-size-fits-all measure with these words like precision, like scientific and such. And so this was in the messaging of the new 10 points that was issued on December 7th. However, this interpreted on the local level was, this is the absolute policy reversal. So what the local governments did basically on the next day, December 8th, was no more control at all. And this was where as Professor Yang would also be tracking on social media, when the hashtag goodbye health code was trending on Weibo, on Chinese social media, because like no one was checking the health codes anymore either. And so I think this is a really interesting situation where how policies that were being imagined or being issued and how they were being interpreted and implemented on the local level really fragments and causes this kind of the situation. I'll just conclude on this point that this kind of seemingly overnight reversal, in a way, we should acknowledge the power and agency of the Chinese people, the protesters who did contribute to the timing of the policy reversal. But on the other hand, what I feel here is it is in a way also a manifestation of state power, that it can change its messaging overnight. And so if it can say the virus is very dangerous on Monday, and then say the virus is no longer dangerous on Tuesday, that by itself is also a manifestation of power. It's just like, the state is going to manufacture and enforce a narrative to its own interests. And the people would it's not aimed at convincing the people. It's not even trying to be credible, but it's trying to flex its power in a way. And it also is a signal that it still has the ability to shift the narrative somewhere down the road according to its own interests and governing agendas.
Fascinating. Is it true that this that the policies or the experiences differed from one city or one region to another, or would you find pretty much the same story throughout the country?
I think it depends on what type of story. I think basically throughout the country, the constant looming threat of a complete lockdown is there, but not in terms of the zero COVID time. So through basically through the end of 2021 to through the year of 2022. That, for example, where my immediate family lives in the central eastern China, the city never went through the kind of blanket lockdown like Shanghai did or many other parts of China did. But that was sheer luck, was that there wasn't really significant outbreaks of cases. There were like clusters of it.
You say that your family didn't go through a severe lockdown. So some places did, and some places didn't.
That was so in the beginning of 2020, at the very beginning of the pandemic, when Wuhan was going under lockdown, and basically effectively all of China was going under lockdown, and that of basically all my immediate and extended family in China experienced. And but what I'm talking about is later during the zero COVID phase with the Omicron variant, starting from late 2021 through the year of 2022, when the lockdown measures were being enforced in a much harsher way, and also much more prolonged because of the nature of the virus. It really cannot be eliminated, and so the outbreaks would always happen from time to time, pop up at different places. But it's not that the entire country was under lockdown the way that most visibly from West is Shanghai was. But the threat of lockdown was always there. So I think it was a constant worry. It was just not just about whether they would have access to food and basic supplies, but also like in case of a medical emergency under these kinds of lockdowns, people were really not able to get basic necessary or even life-saving healthcare in these situations. So that is a reality. Basically, every single Chinese person experienced the fear, and also the daily COVID testings, the restrictions and control on their daily movements and lives. However, for the absolute confinement of the lockdowns, that is not a universal case, but that is by luck. It just depends on whether one person happens to live in the region that experienced an outbreak, and also there is some variations on local implementation as well.
What I saw was a documentary a couple of months ago, maybe, of a town, a small, I gather a village, really, and I don't know where it was, but people went around, talking to the villagers, asking their experience, what had they been going through in terms of COVID, and they said, "Oh, we don't have it. Nobody here." They hadn't been. I gather they hadn't been locked down. They just, it wasn't an issue, like it never had been. But then he investigated it further and found that they'd all had it. But just apparently, not many had died, if any. So maybe they thought they had a cold or something, and they didn't even know they'd had it. That was the explanation given for that particular documentary. I don't remember where I saw it, and maybe some of you have seen something that bears on that question.
I wonder if I might follow up on some of the timeline issue and also the human consequences of it here as it plays out in different places. It's quite interesting in terms of the timeline. If yesterday China announced that it had won the battle with COVID-19, and that basically this very large wave does seem to have subsided as far as we can tell from reports. And it's being stated very strongly as China having had a victory through its strategy in COVID-19. And I think that in some ways this can be said, because by holding back, most of the Chinese population did miss the more virulent strains of COVID-19. There is a sense in which delaying all of this until it was the less virulent Omicron had some benefit. That would be an upside to this, and I think it's one to take seriously. At the same time, China's announcing, according to its official way of narrowly defining death through COVID, reporting in the last couple months over 80,000 deaths directly related to COVID in hospitals.
That's official.
Yes, that they're counting. They have an official way of calculating this in terms of narrow criteria where something is very directly related to COVID and occurs in hospital. And the criteria for recording this varies all over the world, and it's one of the difficulties that epidemiologists face. So we certainly know that as a figure. Now, undoubtedly, the actual figure is of people who are impacted by COVID-19, and the deaths resulting must be higher if you expand the range of the impact. And so we are going to get a larger number. So to some extent, there is this kind of, we're dealing, unfortunately, with layers of public discourse on top of very difficult human realities. So we do have what are certainly more than 80,000 fatalities. On the other hand, what we also have, what's happened also yesterday and today, in fact, I saw it in the news even before I saw the Chinese announcement, was the high-profile publication in the United States of a very contrary point of view, which was putting the deaths more at 1 million or more. And
how many?
It was in the New York Times and on CNN as well, that there's somebody reporting that the estimate would be more like a million or even higher. And there's a wide range of possibilities here. But the interesting point in this kind of argument, because it is very political, is that these reports then compared that with the United States figures of more than 1 million deaths through COVID, without mentioning that the Chinese population is 4 times the size. So basically, we get everybody playing politics with something that's a terrible human tragedy by any measure. So what every illness and severe illness and fatality is serious, and we do want to trace the epidemiology. So we do have to look at this, and the numbers matter. I don't want to reduce this just to a question of an argument over numbers, except that they do enter into both strategies and, unfortunately, into the kind of war of words we have between the United States and China right now. So if we try to look at what then is actually happening, we do have this extremely infectious variant at present that has defeated the zero COVID strategy in effect. It was something that worked with the earlier forms of COVID-19 and wasn't able to completely stop Omicron. And I think what we need to expect is that while this wave is over, that even with vaccination and with some degree of resistance through having a large number of people infected, it is going to continue. So we are looking at a persistent health problem, and the fact that if you estimate, for example, if you take some of the international estimates of something like 1 million fatalities in the last couple of months, that still means that it's a case fatality rate of 0.1%, or not much more. So there is, in effect, a degree of success with some of these policies, but a success about which we have to just feel terribly heartbroken because of all the losses that are involved in it too. So it's an incredibly serious matter, and we do need to try to get at what is actually happening. And China is likely to face continuing waves because that has happened in other parts of East Asia and everywhere. In fact, it's chronic that there are continuous fatalities from Omicron right now. And China's healthcare system is under a lot of criticism at the moment. And it wasn't one of the strongest in the world in any event. And I think that that is something that I think escapes Western observers to some extent, because the China of which we are most aware is in North America is the China that looks a lot like North America. You know, it's Shanghai and these urban centers where people are talking on the web to us in really good English and so on, and have access to fine medical care, which is a reality for coastal and urban China. And the successes in China are really enormous. But there's a sense in which what we're living in is a world in which there are these wonderful centers of science, technology, and healthcare. And then we put out all of the hard work and the difficult living conditions to somewhere else. And where places like the United States and Canada put out that hard work is to less privileged places like the interior of China. And that's where China, coastal China, is putting out its problems too. So within China, we have this area, part of China that's absolutely amazing in terms of its science, technology, its political life, its medical care. And then we have another close to 1 billion people who face quite different circumstances. And these are the people who are picking up the brunt of COVID-19. And that is partly because spread around rural China, of course, you aren't going to have ICUs and medical specialists, and it's just not going to be accessible. And also there's a real gap in terms of the whole economic infrastructure and what's available in rural China.
But when you talk about the
and just to complete that a little bit, it's also the case that there are well over 200 million people from rural China who are migrants working in the cities. So to some extent, the urban problem also gets unloaded on the rural people where their working population, the able-bodied workers, are in the cities and doing all of this work, but where their care, their early childhood care, their care when they're older, the care when they're sick is taken care of in the countryside. So the care burden in the countryside is just enormous. But you had a question.
No, I was asking, I want to know a little bit about the vaccine situation. Apparently, number one, their vaccine wasn't very good. And number two, a lot of people should have taken it and didn't. And as I understand it, old people in particular are under-vaccinated. Too few of them got vaccination. And I don't think this, as I'm guessing, that this was not because the government didn't urge them to, but because their relatives didn't want them to. As I read someplace that the children didn't want their elderly parents to have to suffer by taking vaccinations or something, which is a little bit different from the explanation that we have for what I consider real stupidity in North America. The number of people who should have known better and were somehow politically reactionary or something, and simply don't want to believe that there's such things as viruses or something. I don't understand that mentality, but as I understand it, sort of have the feeling that it's not the same situation in China, that the rationale for either getting vaccinated or not having actually very good vaccines, that it's a different situation, a different explanation than would be the case in North America, for example, or Europe even.
Yes, there are several different reasons for the vaccine hesitancy in China, or just a lower rate of vaccination among elderly people. Some of it is a protectiveness of some suspicion about vaccines. that has some historical reasons, and also a few particular choices that happened. One was, as China first initially developed its vaccine, again out of caution, presumably, it only ran its tests on people under 60. So when the vaccine was approved, there was still the question of, is it safe for the elderly? And if you think you have the vaccine, the epidemic under control, why take this risk? So then the response was, okay, then we're going to do the safety test on older people, and it was done, and it was determined to be safe. And so then there was a bit more vaccination. But there has been some hesitation about vaccination for people who are frail. Another policy choice that was made in China was to focus some of the early vaccination on the people who were most likely to be vectors of the disease, rather than the people who were most vulnerable.
Mhm.
So, that's an issue. It could still be said that maybe there should have been higher rates of vaccination. Maybe possibly there was too much confidence in zero COVID working. So, we just don't know. But there isn't the vaccination rate one would wish. A lot has been done. There's a fairly high rate of people with second doses, but it's lower for the elderly. I can't tell you the exact rates right now because of the last that seem to be published.
I think your voice,
and they've continued to vaccinate. So yes, more vaccination would be helpful, but it doesn't. At present, with Omicron, it doesn't stop people from getting infected. It does reduce the effect. I don't know if my friends have anything to add on the subject of vaccination.
Yeah, like actually, so my mom and my grandmother are still not vaccinated, and and it was a continuous point of frustration for me over the entire past year. And then I think just like following up on Professor Zhao on your points, right? And I think it is I'm hesitant to blame this on individual sentiments, and because it is like policy choices that structured the broader things. As you mentioned, there are historical elements with regards to vaccine safety scandals with other types of vaccines that causes the public to have suspicions with regards to medical products, especially medical products developed so quickly. There were policy choices developed with regards to the early vaccination trials and also the early prioritizations. And I think also very, very importantly, the zero COVID policy, both on the incentive level, that as we also discussed, the vaccine and really is limited in its efficacy with regards to prevention disease, but it is fairly effective in terms of preventing severe disease and death if one gets 3 doses. And however, with the zero COVID policy on one hand, if there is zero COVID, there is no need to get vaccine. And also the vaccine cannot really prevent infection by itself. And also the government prioritization of zero COVID actually prohibited the resource allocation for vaccination drives. And so
you mean officially, or just it was a side effect?
Both, because zero COVID cannot be achieved by vaccination. But zero COVID can be enforced with mass testings and centralized quarantines and these. And so actually what we've seen is not just that the elderly vaccination rate is low, and this is the full vaccination really needs 3 doses. And so a lot of the official figures was really just about 1 dose or 2 doses. And if we look at 3 doses, it is really quite low. On the other hand, was the vaccine, the protection would wane over time. But with the last mass vaccination campaign was in the spring of 2022, and because when the focus increasingly shifted to for mass testing for lockdowns on the resource level, both financially and on the human resource level, and also on the public incentive level, not only the vaccination drive stalled, but also the overall an increase of medical care capacity in China slowed during zero COVID. And also because of the government's controls with regards to people access fever medication and medication that will be used to treat just cold or flu-like symptoms. There was a very severe control on that during zero COVID, because the government wants to be able to track people who have COVID-like symptoms. And this in the urban areas, it is reflected in people just like not having access to, not having easy access to fever-related medication, and that caused a severe shortage in these medications when zero COVID was lifted. In rural regions, I think Professor Judd would have more expertise on this. Actually, like the rural medical care capacity shrank to some extent because some of these fever clinics closed because they are not allowed to just like regularly treat patients. This information, this channel was severely controlled and monitored during zero COVID, and so zero COVID was actually quite devastating to the medical care infrastructure to China. And there is also an underlying element with regards to the vaccination drive. It is that it takes more training to administer a vaccine than to administer a PCR test. And so there is a different level of human resources that is needed for this process. So on the implementation level, implementing mass vaccination is much more difficult than implementing mass testing or mass quarantines. And I actually would love to hear more from Professor Yang with regards to some of the misinformation and disinformation campaigns on social media that some are official or semi-official in an effort to discredit the mRNA vaccines from the West. And that to an extent also contributed to the vaccine hesitancies in general in China. But also there are some filtered anti-vaccination sentiments from like right-wing overseas Chinese language circles that have been filtered back into Chinese social media. I know just like from very anecdotally, even like my mom has forwarded me some of that as a reason that she's telling me not to get vaccinated. And so I would love to hear more from Professor Yang if you've been tracking some of these social media campaigns and some of these trends with these narratives around vaccinations or policies in general.
Yeah, I want to hear too.
Not sure I will answer. Yeah. But I just want to add a couple of remarks about issue of vaccination. I agree with you and Ellen completely about, I think, some of the factors that have discouraged the population from getting more vaccinated. I think the only thing I would add probably is, the public in general, from the very beginning, developed such fear of the virus. It's so much fear of the virus, something that's very, we hear, in Philadelphia, in North America broadly, we know people didn't fear. Didn't even fear death, right? They didn't believe there was that virus.
Some people that way. I feared it all completely. I just have been in lockdown involuntarily ever since.
Exactly.
I still want to go out.
So, but the point is, I think that sense of fear really was the basis for very strong popular support of zero COVID policy. And the effectiveness of the zero COVID policy from the beginning, as Yang said, ironically served as a kind of disincentive for people to get vaccinated, because if the whole community was under lockdown, nobody was going out, there's no chance of being infected. Why would you need to get vaccinated? Right. I think that sense of fear lasted all the way through to the end of last year, and then suddenly, because when the zero COVID policy stopped, we still see people on social media asking, was it true that there were only light symptoms? Could it be really bad? And people are still not sure what this disease might happen, might cause you. There's a lot of fears about the long COVID too. Some of this completely is disinformation. We don't know where the disinformation comes from, but there's a lot of fears about both the getting COVID and then the long consequences of COVID. So that really gives people.
Sure, but you think that they were more scared than we were?
Oh, I think so. I think it definitely the kind of public sentiments there was a strong sense of fear from the very beginning, and that's why people didn't. There was a lot of support of the zero COVID policy, and I know people when that zero COVID policy stopped at the end of last year, that fear began to return. People didn't feel safe anymore to go out of the community.
Well, tell me, if you will, about there was the reason they let up was because there was this huge protest movement, and I want to know about how that happened, because normally, I mean, I do hear that there are protests in China. It's not unheard of, but it's not something that you really expect to see a lot of, or we don't hear much about anyway. But there was a lot of resistance finally, because people had been locked up so long they couldn't get they couldn't get their necessities covered, and they so I just wonder, clearly this must have been, the change of policy must have occurred because they saw the public resistance growing, and people were actually getting violent sometimes. I wonder how much. Do you follow, Professor Yang? Do you follow the newspapers and the other communication systems in China? And do you know how well people are informed and how easy it is to get the kind of accurate information that well, of course, sometimes people don't want accurate information. They pick information that's deliberately not accurate. But so leaving that aside, if people want to know facts, can almost anybody get the truth? Or is the political control of information sufficiently rigorous that people can't know what they need to know, even if they try to find out?
Well, also a question of whether we can find out the truth here when we want to find out the truth, right? Because again, explosion of disinformation everywhere has created a kind of information environment when it's really hard to tell what is truth, what is not truth. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of knowledge, but of course, so that's just one kind of condition. Now, returning to the China situation, this is well known among the political scientists, the scholars who study Chinese politics. The policy process is complicated. It's not always transparent, but doesn't mean. And a lot of the information is not in the official media, but doesn't mean that citizens are completely in the dark. That citizens do know a lot of the critical information, and they are very savvy in finding out the information from a variety of sources. They read official newspapers for signals. They're very good at decoding these signals, but they also, read international media. And nowadays, with WeChat and a lot of these WeChat public accounts, Yang, I'm sure can add to this. A lot of these critical information is translated back into Chinese and circulated on social media. So often, as a matter of fact, I'm surprised that friends and families back in China will tell me, something has happened there, Philadelphia and New York, and I said, what? And I'll go to check. They would know before I do.
Something in the West had happened, they're telling you about.
Yeah. I mean, what I mean is that they have a lot of alternative source of information. But coming again, returning to the question of the kind of sudden policy reversal and street protest and so on, I completely agree with Yang earlier point when she mentioned that probably the policymakers were already considering what to do and what kind of steps to take in terms of this zero COVID policy. And knowing that Omicron is difficult to control completely and economic conditions are really suffering in China. And the street protest provided a timely excuse for them immediately to reverse that policy. Is that right, Yang? My translation of your earlier point. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, thank you. And I actually want to add really quickly on the point about truth. And I think what we've learned through the course of the pandemic is that truth is not only one thing, there is such thing as universal truth, even if following up earlier on Professor Judd's point about even death rate, right? Different countries like the US and China have very different ways of counting COVID deaths, what criteria they use, and the official number the Chinese government releases is, first of all, as Professor Judd also mentioned, it's in hospital. But a lot of people do not die in hospitals, and also even if they do die in hospitals, their deaths may not be recorded as COVID related deaths. And actually, when the Chinese government released the initially 59,000 plus and now later 80,000 plus numbers, it revised its criteria with regards to dying of COVID as well. Because here in the US, a lot of the cases were if the person died and they are COVID positive, it's recorded as a COVID death. But a lot of the Chinese criteria still is that COVID needs to be the leading cause of death. But then that is very, very difficult to evaluate. And then also, I think it is still the criteria that for the Chinese government has revised the leading cause part, but it's still one has to die of respiratory failure to be recorded as a COVID death. But of course, people can die due to other types of organ failures or cardiovascular conditions that are caused by COVID. And so I think even just the death number itself, it is the truth, but there are many interpretations of it. And just as someone trained in the physical sciences, I think there is also a question or a challenge for science communication that simply saying follow the facts or follow the science is not enough. When facts are socially constructed and can be politically manipulated, and also it is a dynamic, vastly changing information that the science by itself can also change because the virus is changing and the social conditions are changing.
Okay,
a wonderful period of learning about how to follow the dynamics of scientific investigation, because it has been changing so rapidly, and the nature of truth is both political and is scientific. We've had an intense public education on this, so I think that we want to recognize there's a lot of that's well known in China too, and it's very difficult to achieve a really good understanding of what the dynamics are of this changing virus.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, we certainly have to acknowledge that there's innocent problem. I mean, there are problems with what is true, and we certainly do have problems of measurement and basis for comparisons and so on. So scientists themselves don't agree as to what is true completely. Let's call that innocent ignorance. But there's also politically motivated deception and obfuscation. And that is, of course, the part that we want to know about, or maybe some people don't want to know about, because that's something you can do something about, whereas you can't by political action, you can't clean up the kinds of ignorance that comes from the fact that people, for very different reasons, use different scales of measurement and so on that may not be comparable. Anyway, I was trying to get at the question of whether there is well, we know that there's certainly been some deliberate hiding of information. Every government does it, but my guess is that China did it a little more than the average, because at the outset, of course, there was a delay in getting the information, and the WHO had trouble getting the information, and then there were teams of people who went to investigate whether or not, for example, the virus came out of that wet market or out of the nearby research lab, and we are told that they were given a tour that was carefully stage managed. So how much? There's no quantitative answer to that, but I think it's worth making the distinction between the kind of innocent ignorance that is just part of the human condition, and the kind of ignorance that is controlled and deliberately manipulated for political ends. Sorry.
I think we live in a world where both those things happen. I think one thing that I think I'm hearing from both Guo Binyang and Yang Chang is, and that is my impression as well, is that there's a great deal more knowledge and participation and protest and pushing back in a variety of ways in China than is recognized outside China. And it happens in a lot of different forms, some of which are just, there's a little bit of control over what is heard outside China. Well, actually quite a bit of control over what's heard outside China, but there's more of it moving around within China. And a lot of the time when there is speech and there's action, it's high risk, but it can be effective. And in the sense, it's easy to practice free speech in Canada because a lot of the time nobody's paying any attention. But in China, there's a little bit more attention given, and I never fail to be impressed with the people who are politically active in a variety of ways, subtle and not so subtle, and effective, and through various channels. So it is a vibrant political culture. And one of the interesting things there, I was talking with a Chinese friend about this just last night, is the extent to which retired workers in Wuhan are right now protesting what is happening in adjustments to their health benefits, because there's a restructuring of health benefits underway in China that some authorities in China say is a very good thing for improving the stability and the quality and the efficacy of the health system, but in the short term result in less in an immediately available health spending account, and that people are pushing back against because their economic situation has been very difficult too after all these years. And so there's an intense engagement about what the public is willing to support in terms of changes to their health benefits. And that's a really interesting discussion to be having. And I think it has a global importance because we have things like that going on at home as well. And probably just about everywhere in the world, health systems are being challenged and there's political debate on that. And we see that in China too, with Wuhan activists. So taking the
Okay, and that almost bears upon the next question I would have liked to raise, except our time is about over. And that is, what lessons can we learn from, if any, from the Chinese experience that may have bearing on our own policies? Is there something to be gained from looking at the Chinese experience and taking lessons from it? Anybody have any final thoughts about that?
For myself, I feel what really should be learned, or one of the things that should be learned, is that China as a country, or the Chinese people, Chinese society, shouldn't be exoticized or essentialized just because of the authoritarian nature of its political system. That sometimes because, as Meta, you also just mentioned, right, the lack of transparency and also the political oppression, it often becomes an excuse for people in the West to cast their own projections or their own imaginations onto the Chinese society, and that is for their own personal agendas or political agendas, or their to feel a sense of moral superiority, and that is just detrimental to both. And what I feel, there is a really nice paper in the Made in China journal about rejecting Cold War binarisms with regards to the different governments' approaches to COVID-19, especially in the context of the biopolitics approach of zero COVID in China and the necropolitics approach of what has been happening in the US, in a lot of the European countries. And I think there is a really lesson to be learned, that this almost becomes a microcosm of the so-called whatever great power competition, that there seems to be a binary choice that both sides, China and the West, can point to the other and a lot of the mistakes they've made as a way to prove their own superiority or their own rightfulness. But the question that really should be asked is that this choice is not a binary. We shouldn't be limited in our moral and political imagination to think that this is just us or them, either or. But there are really better approaches. And at the end of the day, we're all connected together, as this pandemic has taught us that our fates are connected on the surface of this planet. And nations, like the human bodies, are all porous entities.
Spoken like a true peacemaker. Blessings on you. Do you have anything to add to this, Professor Yang?
I think related to Yang point, really, and this is what I wrote most about in my book on the Wuhan lockdown. It's really ordinary people's experiences, the kind of hardships they had to go through, and really all the hard work they put into in managing and navigating something really unprecedented in our lives, and right. And this is not necessarily a lesson, but I think something that we also experience here around us in our own lives, whether we're in Philadelphia or in New York. We know our neighbors, community members working very hard during this period, and silently, quietly, right? In order to the essential workers, in order to support the communities, our students here spend a whole year or more taking classes virtually, and still working very hard. I think these kind of stories I would really love to hear more of from our public media, and these will be important. I think the most important legacies of the pandemic around the world.
Another speech from the heart of a peacemaker. So yes, all of the final admonitions are very consistent with that kind of orientation, which we should all take to heart. It's been very, very interesting talking with you, and I think I've learned a little bit. I appreciate that, and I think our viewers will too. So thank you very much, and have a great day. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Meta.
Thank you for organizing this conversation. I learned a lot as well.
Terrific. Bye.